Chapter 1. Sometimes it shows up in the smallest pauses between words. A conversation that should feel ordinary starts carrying a little more weight than expected, like the air between you and her has changed in a way nobody announced out loud. You're standing there talking about something simple, maybe work, maybe music, maybe something completely random that doesn't matter at all, yet something about the way she looks at you makes the moment feel slightly heavier than the words being said. You might notice it when she holds eye contact just a little longer than people usually do. Nothing theatrical, just that quiet extra second where her eyes stay on you even after the sentence finishes. That extra second is often where a lot of men start second-guessing themselves, because part of you senses what's happening while another part of you tries to dismiss it as imagination. Most guys have experienced this moment before and talked themselves out of believing it meant anything. You tell yourself she's just friendly. You tell yourself maybe she looks at everybody that way. You tell yourself you're probably reading too much into it. And sometimes that hesitation makes sense because nobody wants to assume something that isn't actually there. But attraction has a rhythm to it. It leaks through behavior long before anyone says anything directly. You see it in the way conversations start stretching longer than they logically need to. A topic ends, yet neither of you seems eager to leave the moment. She asks another question that keeps the interaction going. You answer, then she adds something small just to extend the exchange a little further. None of it feels forced. It just keeps happening. You might recognize this pattern from situations where a woman could easily end a conversation, but chooses not to. She lingers in the space around you even after the obvious stopping point arrives. Maybe she laughs a little longer than necessary. Maybe she shifts her body slightly closer when she talks. Maybe her tone softens in a way that feels different from how she interacts with everyone else around her. Attraction rarely announces itself with giant signals. It tends to reveal itself through repetition of small moments that keep pointing in the same direction. When a woman feels drawn to you physically, the energy of the interaction usually becomes more relaxed rather than tense. You may notice that she seems comfortable allowing silence to exist between sentences without rushing to fill it. That quiet space can feel surprisingly intimate because neither of you feels pressure to perform. Sometimes it's in the way she laughs at something you said, even when it wasn't particularly funny. You know the kind of laugh I'm talking about. The kind that arrives a half-second earlier than expected, like the reaction had already been waiting to happen. You've probably seen a situation where a woman interacts with a group of people but keeps redirecting her attention toward one specific person without realizing she's doing it. Her body angle turns slightly in that direction. Her eyes check back there occasionally during the conversation. Even when someone else is speaking, a portion of her awareness seems anchored to that one man. Those patterns can feel confusing if you've never paid attention to them before. Many men miss them entirely because they're waiting for something obvious to happen, something direct, something that removes all uncertainty. Real life rarely works like that. Human attraction tends to operate through subtle signals that build gradually over time. The longer you stay aware of them, the easier they become to recognize. It's less about memorizing behaviors and more about noticing when someone seems quietly invested in your presence. You might remember a moment when you suddenly realized a woman had been leaning closer during a conversation without either of you acknowledging it. Maybe her shoulder brushed yours when she laughed. Maybe she didn't move away immediately afterward. Those tiny physical adjustments sometimes communicate more than anything that gets spoken. Many guys look back later and realize the signs were there long before anything physical happened. The glances, the lingering presence, the way conversations kept circling back toward them. And when you begin noticing those patterns, you start understanding something important about attraction. It rarely begins with bold declarations. It grows quietly inside the interaction itself. If you've ever had that moment where you suddenly realized a woman had been showing interest the entire time, and you only noticed afterward. You already understand what I'm talking about. Those realizations usually come later when you replay the interaction in your mind and recognize the small signals you overlooked. Share one of those moments in the comments if it ever happened to you. A lot of men discover they've had similar experiences once they start paying attention to how attraction actually shows up in everyday interactions. Because the truth is, many women communicate interest through presence rather than statements. They stay close, they stay engaged, they stay curious about you in ways that slowly reveal what's really happening beneath the conversation. Chapter 2. Sometimes the realization doesn't arrive through words at all. It arrives through proximity. The distance between two people quietly changes over the course of a conversation, and nobody announces that it happened. You just notice at some point that she's standing closer than when the interaction began, close enough that small movements start to matter. You might be talking about something ordinary, something that wouldn't normally carry any tension, yet the way she positions herself keeps drawing your attention back to the physical space between you. She doesn't drift away when the conversation pauses. She doesn't step back when someone else moves through the room. Instead, she stays right there, almost as if the moment itself has become comfortable enough that leaving it would feel unnecessary. That comfort with closeness is something many men overlook because they assume it's accidental. People move around during conversations all the time. Someone leans in to hear better. Someone shifts to the side to make room for someone walking by. Someone turns slightly while laughing. Those small movements happen constantly in social spaces. But when a woman feels drawn to you physically, proximity often becomes a quiet choice rather than a random occurrence. She stays within your space longer than expected. Her body language begins orienting toward you naturally. Even when other people are present, there's a subtle sense that your interaction has become its own little environment inside the larger room. You may notice this when a group conversation is happening, and she continues standing beside you rather than drifting to another part of the group. The conversation moves around the circle, different people speak, yet her position remains anchored close to you. It doesn't feel intentional on her part. It simply happens that way. Sometimes it shows up through physical touches that feel casual on the surface, but linger just long enough to catch your attention. A hand briefly resting on your arm while she laughs, a playful nudge during a joke, a moment where her knee brushes yours if you're sitting close together. Those touches rarely feel dramatic in the moment. They're easy to dismiss as friendliness. Yet when they happen repeatedly during the same interaction, the pattern begins speaking louder than any single moment could. You might remember a time when a woman touched your arm during conversation and didn't immediately pull away when the moment passed. Maybe the conversation continued while her hand remained there for an extra second. That small delay often says more than the touch itself. Physical comfort tends to reveal itself gradually. The body relaxes around someone it feels drawn to. The distance between two people shrinks without either of them consciously deciding it should. When that happens, the interaction begins carrying a slightly different energy than ordinary conversations do. There's a quiet awareness that appears in those moments. You become more aware of how close she is standing. You notice the way she tilts her head when she listens to you speak. The conversation may still revolve around completely normal topics, yet the atmosphere surrounding those topics feels warmer somehow. Many men notice this shift, but hesitate to acknowledge it even internally. Part of that hesitation comes from uncertainty. Nobody wants to assume someone is attracted to them and risk misreading the situation. That instinct for caution makes sense, especially in environments where friendliness and attraction can sometimes look similar at first. The difference often reveals itself through consistency. Friendly behavior appears occasionally and then disappears. Attraction tends to repeat the same signals over and over again through different moments of the interaction. You may notice that when she laughs, her body leans slightly toward you instead of away. When someone else begins speaking, Her eyes briefly return to you before focusing on the group again. When there's space to move elsewhere in the room, she still chooses to remain nearby. Those patterns create a quiet rhythm between two people. The conversation continues, yet something else is happening underneath it. The body language becomes softer, the pauses between sentences feel less awkward, and the physical distance remains comfortably small. A single story often captures how these moments unfold. A man once described meeting a woman during a small gathering where several friends were talking in different parts of the room. The two of them started speaking near the kitchen while people walked in and out around them. At first, their conversation stayed casual. They talked about how they knew the host, joked about music playing in the background, and shared a few small stories about places they had traveled recently. The interaction felt easy enough that neither of them seemed aware of how long they had been standing there. At some point, the man noticed something subtle. The woman had shifted closer during the conversation, not dramatically, just enough that their shoulders were almost touching. Neither of them mentioned it. The conversation kept moving naturally. Later, someone else joined the conversation briefly, then drifted away again. When the moment returned to just the two of them, the closeness remained. It didn't reset back to the original distance where the conversation began. The interaction simply continued from where it had evolved. Looking back on that night later, the man realized that proximity had been one of the clearest signals that something more than casual conversation was happening. The words themselves weren't flirtatious, nothing explicit had been said. Yet the physical comfort between them had quietly grown during the interaction. Moments like that often reveal how attraction operates in real life. Sometimes it shows up through the way someone chooses to remain close when there are plenty of reasons they could move away. If you think about conversations you've had where someone stayed physically close, even when the moment allowed distance, you may recognize the feeling those interactions carried. The closeness didn't feel accidental. It felt natural, almost like the interaction had created its own little gravity. And if a moment like that ever happened to you, write it in the comments. A lot of men realize how common those signals are once they start remembering the small details of interactions they once dismissed as ordinary. Chapter 3. Sometimes the shift happens in the way a woman starts looking at you when she thinks you're not fully paying attention. It's subtle enough that most men only catch it accidentally. You're mid-sentence talking to someone else, or you glance away for a second during a group conversation, and when your eyes come back to her, you notice that she was already looking at you before you turned. That moment tends to pass quickly. She may look away almost immediately once eye contact happens again. Nothing that anyone else in the room would notice, yet something about the timing of it stays with you. Those glances often carry a kind of curiosity that's difficult to fake. The look isn't just casual observation, it lingers slightly, as if she's studying you for reasons she hasn't spoken out loud. When you catch it happening more than once during the same interaction, it starts forming a quiet pattern that's hard to ignore. You may recognize that feeling if you've ever looked up during a conversation and noticed a woman already watching you while you were speaking to someone else. The moment often lasts less than a second. Still, it tends to leave a strange impression because it suggests her attention was already centered on you, even when the conversation wasn't directly between the two of you. Attention like that usually reveals itself through repetition rather than a single moment. One glance could mean anything. Several glances scattered across the same interaction begin telling a clearer story. You might notice her eyes returning to you even when another person is speaking. Maybe she laughs at something you said earlier while the group continues discussing something unrelated. Maybe she keeps asking small questions that bring the conversation back toward you without making it obvious that she's doing it. Those small redirections of attention often happen naturally when someone feels drawn to another person. They may not even realize they're doing it. The interaction simply feels more interesting when that person is involved. There's also something about the tone of curiosity that begins appearing in her questions. She asks about things that go slightly deeper than surface conversation. Instead of just responding to what you say, she becomes interested in how you think. You might notice her asking questions that stretch the conversation further than expected. Not in an interrogating way, but in a way that suggests she wants to understand the little details behind your answers. The topic itself may be simple, yet the attention she gives it feels unusually focused. You say something small about your day, and she asks how that happened. You mention a hobby, and she asks how you got into it. You tell a quick story, and she asks what you thought about the moment afterward. None of those questions feel heavy. They just extend the interaction in ways that keep you talking a little longer. What many men miss is how much emotional investment exists inside curiosity like that. People rarely ask follow-up questions when they feel neutral about someone. Curiosity often appears when someone's interest has moved beyond casual politeness. You may have experienced this in conversations where a woman seems especially engaged with what you're saying, even when the topic itself isn't particularly exciting. She reacts quickly. Her expressions change with your story. She remembers something you mentioned earlier and brings it back later in the conversation. Those small details reveal attention, and attention is one of the strongest early signals of attraction that exists. Sometimes the signal becomes visible through the way she reacts when the conversation pauses. Instead of letting the moment fade naturally, she restarts it with something small. Maybe a new question appears. Maybe she remembers something funny that happened earlier. Maybe she simply comments on something around you both to keep the interaction alive. That willingness to keep the moment going usually reflects enjoyment of the interaction itself. When someone feels drawn to another person, conversations rarely feel like something that needs to end quickly. Imagine a man meeting a woman during a friend's birthday dinner where several people were sitting around a large table talking in different directions. Conversations overlapped constantly as people laughed and told stories. The man and the woman sat across from each other. At first, they barely spoke directly. The table conversation included everyone, and different people jumped into the discussion as topics changed. At some point, the man noticed something small. Each time he said something during the group conversation, the woman reacted almost immediately. She laughed quickly when he made a joke. She looked toward him when he spoke, even if someone else was already talking. Later in the evening, their individual conversations started forming naturally while the group continued around them. They began asking each other small questions across the table. The tone felt light and easy. What stood out later when he thought about that night was how often he caught her watching him when he wasn't speaking directly to her. Several times their eyes met unexpectedly across the table because she had already been looking in his direction. The attention between them created a quiet awareness that the interaction carried a slightly different energy than the rest of the table conversation. Moments like that often reveal how attraction builds gradually through attention. A woman who feels physically drawn to you usually finds herself paying closer attention to your presence than she does to others around you. That attention shows up through small details, the way she listens, the way her eyes return to you during conversations, the way she remembers things you mentioned earlier. If you think about interactions where someone seemed unusually attentive to the things you said, there's a good chance you've already experienced this kind of moment before. Sometimes it becomes obvious only after the interaction ends and you replay the details in your mind. If a situation like that ever happened to you, share it in the comments. Many men realize later that attention was one of the clearest signals of attraction once they start recognizing how those small moments fit together. Chapter 4. There are moments when the energy between two people changes in a way that doesn't come from anything either of them said. The conversation might still sound normal on the surface, the topic might still be something light and harmless, yet underneath it there's a different kind of awareness starting to build. You notice it in the way her voice softens slightly when she speaks to you, compared to how she was talking a few minutes earlier to someone else. If someone asked you to explain exactly what changed, you might struggle to describe it. Yet the tone feels warmer somehow, slower, like the interaction has become more focused on the space between you rather than the words themselves. That shift in tone often happens when a woman begins feeling physically comfortable around a man. Her voice drops slightly. Her laughter becomes quieter and more personal rather than loud and performative. Even the way she pronounces certain words might slow down, as if the conversation itself has become more relaxed. You might notice this if you've ever watched how someone talks in a group versus how they talk when the conversation narrows down to just one person they're interested in. The difference is subtle but real. The energy becomes more contained, more directed. Sometimes it shows up in the way she begins teasing you gently. Not aggressive teasing meant to challenge you, but playful comments that feel slightly more personal than ordinary jokes. She might point out something about the way you said something. She might laugh at a small habit she noticed during the conversation. Those playful comments usually carry a tone that invites reaction rather than defense. The teasing creates a small emotional connection because it signals that she feels comfortable enough to step slightly closer into your space without worrying how you'll react. You may remember moments when a woman joked about something specific you said earlier, almost like she had been paying close attention to the details of the conversation. That kind of teasing rarely appears when someone feels neutral. It often emerges when there's already some level of interest building underneath the interaction. Another place this energy shows up is through the way she responds to your humor. The reaction may feel a little stronger than expected. Something small you say creates a laugh that lingers longer than the moment itself. Her body language opens up during that laughter. She might lean slightly toward you, touch your arm briefly, or tilt her head while she reacts. Those physical reactions often happen naturally because attraction relaxes people's boundaries around someone they enjoy being near. The body becomes more expressive. Movements become less guarded. You might notice how quickly she reacts when you say something playful. The laughter comes immediately, sometimes before the sentence even finishes. That quick reaction often reveals how engaged she feels in the interaction itself. There's also a certain kind of eye contact that tends to appear during moments like this. It's steady without feeling intense. Her eyes stay on you while you're speaking, and when the conversation pauses, she doesn't immediately look away like people usually do in casual interactions. Instead, the pause stretches slightly. You both notice the silence, yet neither of you rushes to fill it. Those moments often carry a quiet kind of tension that feels different from ordinary conversation pauses. Many men experience these moments and assume they're imagining the shift in energy. Part of that hesitation comes from uncertainty. Attraction can feel ambiguous when it appears through small behaviors rather than obvious signals. Yet when these small signals begin repeating across an interaction, they tend to form a pattern that becomes clearer with time. The tone of her voice, the softness of her laughter, the way she teases you lightly, the comfortable eye contact during quiet moments. Each piece by itself might not mean much. Together, they create a feeling that something underneath the conversation is quietly building. A man once described talking with a woman during a late evening gathering where most people had already left. Only a few friends remained in the room, sitting on couches and talking casually while music played quietly in the background. At first, their conversation felt like any other conversation during the night. They talked about work, about friends they had in common, about things that had happened earlier in the evening. Nothing about it felt particularly unusual. Over time, the room grew quieter as people drifted into smaller conversations. The man and the woman continued talking while sitting beside each other on a couch. At some point, the tone of the conversation changed slightly. Her voice became softer. Her laughter felt more personal, almost like it belonged specifically to the interaction between the two of them, rather than the entire room. She began teasing him about something he had said earlier that night. The comment was playful, and the way she delivered it carried a warmth that hadn't been present earlier in the evening. The conversation slowed down naturally after that moment. Neither of them rushed through their sentences. Eye contact lingered longer than usual. The room around them continued moving with other conversations, yet their interaction felt like it existed in its own space inside the larger environment. Later, when the man thought about that moment, he realized the signals had been there throughout the conversation. The softened tone, the teasing, the quiet pauses between sentences. Together, they created an atmosphere that felt noticeably different from the rest of the night. Attraction often reveals itself exactly like that. It's less about grand gestures and more about the emotional texture of the interaction itself. The tone shifts, the body language relaxes, the attention becomes more focused. If you think back to conversations where the energy between you and someone else suddenly felt warmer without any obvious reason, you've probably experienced that shift before. The words may have stayed simple, yet the atmosphere between you changed in a way that felt hard to explain. If a moment like that ever stood out to you, share it in the comments. Hearing those experiences often helps people recognize how subtle attraction signals can be when they first appear. Chapter 5. Sometimes the realization arrives later, long after the conversation has already ended. You're replaying the interaction in your mind for no particular reason, just remembering how the night went or how the conversation unfolded. And suddenly, certain moments begin standing out in a way they didn't when they first happened. It might be the way she delayed leaving even when the moment seemed finished. You remember how the conversation had already reached a natural stopping point, yet she lingered a little longer. Maybe she adjusted something small like her bag or her jacket. Maybe she mentioned one last thing before walking away. Maybe she simply stayed standing there while both of you talked about something random that had nothing to do with the earlier conversation. Those moments often reveal something interesting about attraction. When someone feels drawn to another person physically, they tend to stretch interactions just slightly beyond the moment where they logically should end. It isn't always conscious. The person simply feels comfortable remaining there a little longer. You might notice this when a woman says goodbye but doesn't immediately walk away. The goodbye turns into a small continuation of the conversation. A quick comment appears. Another laugh happens. The moment resets itself briefly before finally ending. Many men miss the meaning behind that kind of moment because they assume she was just being polite. Politeness usually ends conversations quickly and cleanly. Lingering tends to happen when someone doesn't feel ready to leave the interaction yet. There's also something about the way she leaves that can reveal interest. Instead of walking away abruptly, she might turn back briefly to say something small. Maybe she makes eye contact again before leaving. Maybe she smiles in a way that feels slightly more personal than a simple goodbye gesture. Those tiny closing moments often carry the same emotional signals that appeared earlier in the interaction. The softened tone, the lingering eye contact, the sense that the interaction itself had become enjoyable enough that ending it feels slightly disappointing. You might remember a situation where a woman said she had to leave but stayed talking for another few minutes before actually going. During that time, the conversation usually feels lighter than anything that happened earlier. People tend to relax during those final moments because the pressure of the interaction has already passed. Sometimes she asks a small question right before leaving, something that keeps the connection alive beyond the moment itself. Maybe she asks what you're doing later that week. Maybe she comments on something you mentioned earlier in the conversation. The question isn't heavy or complicated. It simply extends the connection slightly past the current moment. Those final exchanges often carry more meaning than people realize. When someone wants to maintain a connection with you, even briefly, they tend to leave the interaction open rather than closing it completely. You may also notice how she looks at you during that final moment. The eye contact may last slightly longer than earlier in the conversation. The smile may appear softer, more personal, almost like the moment carries something unspoken. These signals tend to appear quietly, almost like small echoes of the energy that existed during the interaction itself. The attention she gave you earlier often returns briefly before she leaves. One story captures this moment well. Imagine talking with a woman after meeting her through friends at a small gathering. They spent most of the evening talking casually while other people moved around the room. The conversation stayed relaxed the entire time, moving from topic to topic without much effort. Eventually, the evening started winding down, and people began leaving one by one. The woman mentioned that she needed to head out as well. They said their goodbyes, and she started walking toward the door. Just before leaving the room, she turned back and asked him something small about a story he had told earlier that night. It wasn't an important question. It simply reopened the conversation for another minute or two. They talked briefly again near the doorway while others were putting on their jackets and saying goodbye to the host. After that second goodbye, she left for real this time. Later, the man thought about that moment and realized something interesting. The conversation near the door had felt warmer than anything earlier in the evening. The tone had softened. The eye contact had lasted longer. The moment had stretched slightly beyond the original goodbye. That small extension revealed something the man hadn't fully recognized earlier. The interaction between them had carried a kind of attraction that showed itself quietly throughout the night. Attraction often reveals itself exactly like that, through small decisions to remain present in the interaction, through lingering moments that stretch past natural endings, through eye contact that lasts just a little longer than necessary. When you begin noticing these signals, the way you experience conversations starts changing slightly. You stop searching for gestures and begin recognizing how much communication happens through small behaviors that repeat themselves naturally during interactions. You might think back to conversations where someone stayed a little longer than expected before leaving, or where the goodbye moment seemed to take several tries before it finally happened. Those moments often reveal how comfortable someone felt inside the interaction itself. If you've ever experienced a moment like that, where a goodbye turned into one more conversation before someone finally left, write about it in the comments. A lot of people realize later that those final moments often revealed more about the connection than anything that happened earlier in the conversation.